Hello, everyone. This is Candice Dickens, your dope Black therapist, and I want to thank you for spending time with me. I want to talk about a topic that's often not talked about enough, which is military trauma. I had originally invited two other speakers, but they couldn't be here, who were soldiers in the Army and Navy. So I want to talk from it from perspective of a clinical perspective and also from the perspective of a child of a soldier. My father, Everett Richardson, served in the Vietnam War. And when he came back in his 20s, he was so different from who he was before he left. I often hear about stories about my father just being the life of the party, right? Gorgeous man, life of the party, played instruments, self-taught, played the guitar. Just really a good-natured, quiet, soft-spoken person, just with a big, big heart. And when he came back in his mid-20s, he was a very different guy. That gregarious, fun-loving guy who was soft-spoken. Often speech was slurred because the way that he coped was through alcoholism. Because one of the things he often said was, I can never forget what I don't want to remember. And that's profound if you have a loved one who is haunted by the memories of servicing overseas. They can't forget who died in front of them. They can't forget the tour where they almost felt they weren't going to make it. They can't forget being in a town with people who they thought were friendly, who were not friendly. They can't forget the fact they couldn't even trust children to come up to them, that they lost a sense of reality and an inability to figure out who to trust, who was safe, even within their own military, cadet team. They lost the ability to figure out who was safe, who was going to marginalize them because of the color of their skin or because of their rank. They couldn't figure it out. Who was trying to compete to be top dog? They couldn't figure it out. So for many soldiers, they hardened, they isolated, they learned how to escape. Right? In the 60s, there were lots of drugs that were around, but the biggest drugs were alcohol and morphine, heroin, LSD, and it allowed them to check out from all the pain they were experiencing. And then after a while, they only knew how to check out. And they couldn't figure out, how to deal with all this rage and this anger because this was a different kind of war. This was a war that involved chemical destruction, warfare that they couldn't see, couldn't smell, but they were never the same, right? So in our home, the way that experience would show up is that he would line us all up and we'd have to act like soldiers and kill roaches with our hands, which I still think is very disgusting. But it also showed up in watching him just having episodes of real profound sadness and never quite being easy in his skin. And this guy that was so easygoing became agitated often and spiraled into this place that wasn't healthy and wasn't good for him and didn't honor him. And there wasn't a name for it. And he also came home to a country that didn't appreciate him, who saw him as the baby killers, who didn't respect him because he wasn't fighting the man. He wasn't fighting the powers that be, like the Black Panthers. He was just this guy that was trying to figure out how to make money for his family and who wanted to serve because back then it was the thing to do. Other than going into a factory to work or going to college, it was the alternative for Black men. And it still is an alternative for a lot of young men. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm bashing the military. I'm not. I am so honored for all the women and men who sacrifice time with their families in order for me to have freedom. I appreciate the fact that because of you, I can be home, I can have normalcy. But I also recognize that part of the experience is a traumatic experience because things happen from day one, from being in boot camp. Things happen when they lose control. They don't control when they wake up, when they go to sleep. They don't control who's near them, who's not near them. And for some military people, they can't control who's sexually harassing them and who's not sexually harassing them. They can't control how racism shows up and how it doesn't show up. They can't control when someone says, hey, go into that field where there are landmines or go into that field where people are shooting at you. And they can't say no. They lose their ability to choose and they lose their ability to trust. Because sometimes the enemy wasn't just in those fields. Sometimes the enemy was in their bunks. Sometimes the enemy was marching into the field with them. Because there's something called friendly fire where sometimes you get killed by people who are in your military unit and who shoot you by accident or shoot you on purpose. And the thing that my father said was that he lost his ability to have humanity. After all, he became hardened and lost his ability to be vulnerable, because vulnerability was not something that was embraced on the battlefield, right? Toughness was, strength was, order was, discipline was. And he came back with all of that, right? Teaching us to be soldiers and not realizing that when he came back to Red Hook Projects, to Brooklyn, New York, there was no war in his house, except the war that was in his head. And that we were children and not soldiers. And I know for a lot of families who have people coming back from the military, what they'll say is, wow, they came back so different, especially if they were overseas and war. They came back with nightmares, anxiety, depression, agitation, conflict, or they came back not being able to jump back into regular life, right? Because it's an adjustment. It's an adjustment going from a place where your guard is up to a place where, wow, my guard is not up. And the mind takes a while to adjust to that. And then when you add trauma of seeing people get harmed or trauma of not being able to protect yourself from harm, that's a whole nother layer that goes with that feeling of trauma, that something happened to you on that field. And we're talking about sexual trauma. Something happened to you on that field, and sometimes in your latrine or with your commander, something happened to you that sometimes doesn't get honored. And sometimes people gaslight you and say, oh, it wasn't a big thing. Well, we're a unit, and use gender against you. Or something happened to you because you were male. And someone accused you of doing something that was horrible. And maybe you didn't, but because this is a no tolerance military, some things happened to you. That trauma is real within the military. There are different forms of it. And it's good to recognize that things happen to people who serve and they come back different. And then they come back to a family and the family becomes different. And a family that's been waiting for you to come home, especially when you have that income, looks forward to having you come home. And the first fantasy is, I'm going to go back and get a job. I'm going to school. And you don't really factor in the fact that you might have post-traumatic stress disorder, where you're having flashbacks, uneasiness, where you can't stop your mind from racing or thinking about something, or you have moments where you black out a little bit, like, oh my goodness, how did I get here? You have that fugue experience where you're driving and you don't know how you got there because there's a part of your brain that tunes out and doesn't know how to tune back in. Because when we do disconnection, we do it because the mind doesn't feel safe. And whatever you're experiencing is too much, so you've got to close your eyes or the brain shuts down. Just as a way of managing it day to day. And I want those families to know that it is a trauma to see someone who has trauma. It is a trauma to watch someone become angry or become defensive, right? Or someone who doesn't want anyone in the house because they can't trust. Or it's traumatic coming home and leaving a wife who is pregnant or a husband who is in school and then coming home and this husband has graduated, or that child that the wife was pregnant with is now a 4-year-old or a 2-year-old. And you've missed time and you have more of a relationship as a relative than as a parent. Or having to give your children away because you got to go overseas and you're missing out on all those things. And that's a trauma that comes with guilt and shame and all of that. And we carry that in the body, which is why it's not surprising that a lot of veterans have a lot of medical illnesses, and some are connected directly to what happened to them physiologically in the military, and some of them's related to what happened to them emotionally. And emotional pain will show up in the body as somatic pain with headaches and stomach aches and back aches, because we carry our emotions in our body. That those emotions just don't disappear. You carry you wherever you go, and every experience you have shows up in the body, shows up in the emotions, the spirit, is that heaviness that's there. And especially if you come home, you served your country and you're not embraced, or you come home and you think it's going to be great with this GI Bill and things don't quite happen. So what happens instead is, I can't get a job. And if I can't get a job and I don't have income, then I'm homeless. And that's another trauma of being out of control, being powerless. And that experience creates resentment. So we've got trauma, we have grief, and then we have resentment. It's like a layer. And for many people, they don't know how to manage that. So they turn to a chemical addiction or food addiction, right? Or they get lost in the system. And for family members, they feel powerless because the more they try to help, the more the service member might feel resentful because they feel like, wow, you're not respecting me as an adult. You're trying to take over. And it triggers that part of them that doesn't want to be dominated, that doesn't want to be controlled. So you're helping and they're pushing it back. It becomes a power struggle. And all you want to do is help, but all you're getting is resistance, which is why a lot of relationships, a lot of marriages with service members end shortly after they come home. It's the struggle, the adjustment of all these new things happening, and all the dreams that happen don't quite happen the way you thought they would. So one of the things I want to talk a little bit is about how to cope with that. There's this technique called EFT, emotional focus technique, in which you find the nerve centers in the body and you put pressure on them, similar to acupuncture, where if you go to an acupuncturist, they'll put a pin here. You've got a nerve, and this nerve goes directly to the brain. All emotions are in the brain, even though they show up in the body. So we'll say it's really a top-down experience. What happens in the brain always shows up in the body. So when you touch on the nerves, it goes back up to the brain and says to the brain, calm down. Right? It sends a nerve. So if I'm tapping here, this is a tap or a pressure point. So when people are anxious or we call them not regulated, we'll say, why don't you rock? Right? Calm the body down. It's like calming the baby down. Tap on that part between your ring finger or do a tap. And if by chance I called it the wrong thing, EFT, it's either emotional freedom technique or emotional focus technique. But if you Google it on YouTube, you'll see the right name. But I was called EFT. If you tap here, right, it's real sensitive. It's like it tickles. You have a whole bunch of nerve fibers. So what you're really trying to do is the back of the brain is where all the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain is at. You're really trying to get that back of the brain to calm down. Because if this part can calm down, the part of the brain that thinks about what you're thinking come online. When we're upset, you're not you, like that commercial with the snicker bars. You're not you when you're upset. The part that thinks about what you're thinking goes offline and you're all emotion. Like every other animal, humans are all emotions. And in order to get this part to calm down, you've got to calm the body down, which is why we'll say tap here, tap here. These are places where you can tap here. You can tap the top of your head, in between your eyebrows, the side of your eyes, underneath your nose, underneath your lip, collarbone, rib cage or the bar line for the ladies. If you want to get fancy, you can do a bilateral. What does that mean? It means you're taking the right part of your body and you're putting on the other part, right? You're crossing parts because the right part of the brain is the emotional part of the brain. And as everyone knows, the emotional part of the brain develops way before the logical part, the speech part. So babies are all emotional. They cry, they want warmth, they want food. This is the right part of the brain. And when we get upset, that oldest part of that brain becomes dominant. And what we'll say is you really need that left part so you can think about what you're thinking, so you can sober up from that emotional dump you just had. So we'll say, take that right hand, put it on the left part of your body and tap or stroke, right? Or you got right hand on left leg, tap or rub. Bring that left part of your brain back in line. If you want to rock, or say to clients, just do a hug. Because you really need that left part on line. And self-hugs are great because the body doesn't care who's hugging you. All it knows is that, wow, you're hugging me. So there's this chemical in your brain called oxytocin that gets released. And oxytocin, in the body gets released. And it's a calming chemical. The body likes it. It allows us to have rest and digest. So the more you hug, the more oxytocin, which is calming to you. But if I do the tapping, I might even add a sentence then, which sounds like, even though I'm upset because I didn't get the job I wanted, and I thought coming home as a soldier, that things would be easy, I will still choose to believe that things will work out for me. I don't know how they will. I don't know how they will. And what I forgot to mention is before you begin tapping, do a rating from 0 to 10 where you're at. I'm at 10. You're going to tap until you go down to a 5. You don't have to be at a 0. 5s are good. But it's really giving yourself permission to tap. And if you want to add this stem, it's always, even though, I will still choose, And when you're tapping, after you say it, you can just continue talking. And taking a breath in between. And taking a breath in between. Because what happens is that in the military, we're disconnected. You got to be disconnected in order to run into a field where someone's shooting at you, where their mind's at. Because if you're overly connected, you'd be overly emotional and you couldn't pull a gun. You couldn't maneuver, you couldn't save your friends. So you have to disconnect in the military in order to serve, in order to show up for the trauma and function in the trauma. And then what happens when families, when they have someone come home and they're disconnected and they're upset, and then you start helping them, you reach them, and you realize afterwards, like, it's not helping, and then you become disconnected. So what we'll say to family members is that tap, connect you back, that even though I'm frustrated, I will still choose to believe that this too will pass. This too will pass. Right? I'm connecting back to the self, from a disconnected place to a self-connected place. Yeah. If you're someone who's looking for a trauma specialist, I want to invite you to visit us at thecoloroftraumaandhealing.com. It's my BIPOC trauma directory that lists several providers who offer specializations in trauma care, especially for people who are brown, indigenous, people of color. If you're someone who's a provider and you would love to be part of this directory, visit us at coloroftraumaandhealing.com. Membership is free for the first 60 days, but by joining, it helps in the cycle of trauma and creates a path for healing for everyone. Thank you for being part of this experience with me today, and I look forward to seeing everyone again at the next video.